Hi guys, Ross here and welcome back to another video. So in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to create this deboss effect within Cinema 4D using animated textures. Now I just want to say that this effect is inspired by Hello Playful. They're a really cool creative collective, as they say in their bio on Instagram, and they recently created this NAS Radiance launch campaign. Now within this animation, which is really cool by the way, you should go and check it out, I'll put a link in the description. They have this part of the video where the NAS logo gets debossed into the plane and you get this cool kind of like liquidy effect going on here. So that's the effect that we're going to be covering today. And yeah, hopefully you guys find this tutorial helpful. Let me know in the comment section down below if you do. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this, and hit that notification bell so you know when I upload. Okay, I'm going to stop waffling and we'll jump straight into the video. So I've got this project file here. I'm just going to close the video quick. I've got this project file here with everything set up. You can see it doesn't look too complicated, so let's just create a new one. So file, new project, and let me just refresh that. And I'm going to create a plane material, and I'm going to scale this up to about 800 by 800, not 80, there we go, not 0 either, 800 by 800, because I know that's the scale I built the other one to. And essentially to create this effect we're going to be using displacement. So I'm just going to kind of show you the principles of how this is going to work. So I'm going to create a Redshift material and just drag that onto the plane. And let's just get the render view going here. So I'm going to go into the material and I'm going to press Shift C and type in texture. And I prefer doing it through the Shift C way just because it's a little bit quicker than having to come over here and type it in. But that's all personal preference. And I'm just going to find a texture quickly, something like this. Just a normal kind of scratchy, smudgy texture. So essentially we're going to use this texture to drive the displacement of this plane. So I'm going to press Shift C and get a displacement node, and we're just going to plug the texture into texture and text map and then plug that into displacement and just put the material back to the surface. Okay, so at the moment we're not seeing anything, and that's because in order to use displacement within Redshift we need to add a Redshift tag. So I'm going to go to plane, Redshift tag and Redshift object, and just come into geometry, override the geometry and enable displacement. Now we can start to see the texture appear. I'm just going to zoom in so we can see it a bit clearer, and there we go, we can start to see just some displacement in the plane. Now at the moment it's not too drastic. If I was to increase the scale on the displacement node to say something like 5, you can start to see how this is beginning to increase in the plane. So the way displacement works, if you didn't already know, is that it basically takes the black and white values of an image to determine what parts of it to displace. So if I was to plug this texture into the surface, you can see that we've got a range of values ranging from black to white. So at the moment it's basically taking these whiter areas and embossing those more, and as we fade to black they're being embossed less and less. So if I was to put a ramp in, so Shift C ramp, and connect that to a ramp, and then that to the surface, and I crush this so that it was literally either black or white, something like this, and plug that into the displacement, we'd get a much different result because it's either there or it's not. Whereas if we're just using the texture without a ramp, we're getting those in-between points because there's shades of grey in there as well. So essentially anything that's black isn't going to get displaced at all. It's going to stay completely flat, nothing, no displacement whatsoever. If you have areas of complete white in there, they're going to be displaced to the absolute maximum. So at the moment we've got a scale of 5, so they're going to be scaled by 5, whatever that means. But essentially they're going to be displaced as much as you allow it to be displaced by, and then anything in between is going to be like a middle point between nothing and everything. So that's essentially how that works, and we're going to take those principles to then apply this effect to create a deboss effect within the plane. And the way we're going to do that is actually by using After Effects. So I'm going to jump into After what is wrong with my voice, bro? So we're going to jump into After Effects, and you can see I've got this simple animation set up. All that's happening is I've just got each letter fading on one by one, and I actually need to extend this out just to fit the whole composition. I've just got each letter fading on one by one, and if you were to cast your minds back to the animation I did, you'll remember that each letter faded on one by one, and that's because if we were to think about how the principles of displacement work, anything that's white will get embossed, anything black will stay the same. Now if we were to reverse that, so we put a negative displacement value, anything that's white will deboss, anything that's black will stay the same. So as these letters start to animate on, so the R comes on, that means that as it fades to white, it's going to start to get debossed and pressed into the plane. And as the rest of the letters come on, the same thing's going to happen to them. So you could do this with any kind of animation. This is a very simple example, but you could create some really cool effects by using this concept and playing with displacement. So I've got this animation set up. I don't really want to talk too much about actually animating within After Effects because that isn't the bulk of this video. But I can show you how to export this to get it working within Cinema. So I've got this animation set up, and it's on a composition of 4000 by 4000 pixels at a frame rate of 30 frames per second. The reason for the size is that if we wanted to do close-up detail shots, it just ensures that the quality is going to be good enough for that kind of detail. Frame rate, we're going to want to make sure it's 30, or whatever you're using in Cinema, you want them to match. So we're going to go up to Composition, Add to Render Queue, and you can see how many times I've done this before. And we can use we can keep the render settings at pretty much the same. You just want to make sure that it's the duration of your composition. It's using the comp's frame rate, so 30 frames per second. But when we come into the output module, you're going to want to change this from AVI, or it might be QuickTime if you're on a Mac. And we want to change this to a PNG sequence, and that's because this is the best format for Cinema 4D to read it in. I'm not sure if it works if you import like an MP4, for example. I think it needs to be in a JPEG or a PNG sequence or something like that, where we have an image for every single frame. I think that's the way that Cinema 4D kind of works with it best, so that's the way we're going to do it. So we've got it set up as PNG sequence, and everything else we can leave the same. That's all good. And you then just want to find a folder to save it out as. So you can save it in a subfolder here, and then save this as whatever you want to call it. I've already got it exported, so if I come into here, you can see I've got every frame from frame 0 all the way up to 210, which is the final frame in the animation. And you can see how that kind of grows from just nothing to the full word mark there. So you can go ahead, render this out. I've already done it, so I'm going to skip over that waiting part. But we're going to jump back into Cinema, and essentially we're just going to swap out this texture we've put in here and just find the animation we made a second ago. So I believe I put it in here somewhere. Cool. And we're just going to select the first image. Even though it's completely black, we're basically going to allow Cinema to go through all these images to create the kind of animated deboss effect. So I'm going to hit open on that first frame, and as you can see, nothing is happening because we've got a completely black texture, which means, as we know, that there's going to be no displacement. So even if we were to scroll through the timeline, we can see nothing's happening. It's not going through the animation, and you're probably wondering what the hell is going on. So we actually need to come up to the animation tab of our texture and set the mode to simple. Still, we can't see anything, and that's because the final step we need to do to get this to work is set an end frame. Now we know that the animation is 180 frames long because if we go into the output folder, we've got the name and then we've got the frame it is. So this is 180. So we know this is 180 frames long. So we want to go into the texture, animation, and set the end frame to 180. And now you can see we're starting to get that emboss effect in the plane. A few other things you want to be wary of: just make sure the frame rate is the same as the animation you rendered out and the same frame rate as your actual Cinema 4D project. And then you've got a few other settings here which you could change. So you could set it from simple to loop, so it's going to loop that animation sequence over and over. Or you've got ping pong, which is kind of like the boomerang effect, where it's going to get to the end and then reverse its way back to the start. So you've got a few different settings you can play with there to create some cool effects. We're just going to leave it on simple for now. So I'm just going to extend my project out to, let's say, 210 frames, just so we've got a bit of overhang on that. And as we scroll from the beginning through to the end, it's going to take a second to kind of refresh these, but you can get the general idea. You can see how the letters start to fade on and then emboss into the plane. So the final frame, 180, that's at its maximum. And at the moment we're getting an emboss effect. So what we need to do to reverse that to deboss is fairly simple. We're just going to come into our displacement node and set this to something like -5 instead. -5, not -56. So at the moment you can't really tell the difference between embossing and deboss, and that's because we need to set up some lights to really help cast shadows and highlights in the right areas. So we're going to jump into that, but before we do, I just remembered that we need to enable the gamma override. This is something that you just need to enable for Redshift to calculate the texture properly. It probably doesn't make too much of a difference because we're using a fairly black and white texture, but if you had something a bit more detailed, this is really just going to help it to act the way it should. I'm also going to tick sRGB because that's the color profile we're working in. And yeah, everything is good there. So let's start setting up a camera and some lights. So I'm just going to get a Redshift camera here and set this to portrait just so we take out a bit of the perspective. And just kind of set the angle up that we want, maybe something like this. Zoom in a little bit, rotate this around and center it, and something like that looks quite cool. And then I'm just going to put a protection tag on that, so I'm going to right click, rigging tag and protection, and let's start setting up an area light. So got an area light here, I'm just going to right click, put a target tag on it and set that to the plane. So basically wherever we move this area light, it's always going to be facing towards the access point of our plane. This is a really cool technique for if you're just moving lights around a lot and you want it to focus on an object. It just saves you having to constantly rotate the light. So I'm just going to set the render view to lock on the camera, and that means we can jump out of the camera and just move around this scene a bit easier. And I'm going to set it to quick shading so I can just see what's going on a bit easier. Cool, so let's play with this light, and I'm just going to scale it up and maybe shrink it in like this, and just play with the angles just so we get the right look. And maybe it's debossed a little bit too much, so maybe we'll just put -3, something like that. Okay, cool. So at the moment we've got like a super shiny material, and we kind of just want to help take some of that out. So I'm going to add a little bit of roughness just to kind of soften out that light a little bit. And I still think it's in the wrong position, so I'm just going to fix that up. So maybe bring it around at more of a diagonal position, and maybe flip it over to, hold on, it's bugging out. Maybe flip it over to this side here, and you can already see how that's starting to make a much better change to the look of the animation. So now we can see that that's actually debossed into the material. So that's something that's quite important, is just setting up your lights in the way that's going to give the best look and really help make it apparent that this is a deboss and not an emboss. Cinema 4D is lagging a little bit, so let's move that around. Cool. So that looks quite good. We could probably have another light over where we had one before just to get a nice highlight. So I'm just going to move that over here just to help add some fill as well. Cool, something like that, and then we can just decrease this down. So something like this. Cool, so this is looking pretty good. This is just helping to fill it out a little bit more, and I think there's a few things we can do just to kind of improve the overall look at this. First of all, make sure we've got Redshift set up and GI turned on. That's going to be pretty important, so brute force on both of those. And then let's just play with the colour. So I'm going to put like this kind of reddish, kind of like orangey colour we had going on, so something like this perhaps. Maybe we can bring that down, make it a bit more redder, something like that. And we can play with the reflection on that, just add a little bit of warmth into it. Cool, like this. And then I also added some subsurface to it, so I put about 0.05 and then maybe like 0.1, and I just dialed in the actual kind of colours of the material, so something like this kind of orangey colour in the scatter coefficient, and then a similar kind of thing in the absorption colour. So all that's going to do is take out some of the blacks in the shadows. So if I was to turn it off, you can see it's a lot darker, whereas now we have that kind of colour going through it a bit more. So you could probably dial it down a little bit. Yeah, maybe 0.3, something like that. And you can tinker with these to get the right look you want. Maybe put that back up to 0.5. I don't want to focus too much on subsurface scattering. I've got a whole separate video on that if you want to check it out. But that's kind of the basics of that. So okay, so it's looking pretty good. The only other thing we could do now to kind of add some more interest and detail to this is add something like a displacer. So I'm going to select the plane, hold shift and grab a displacer, and that's going to make it a child of the plane. And we can go into shading and add some noise. And at the moment we're not seeing too much of a difference, and that's because we haven't got enough polygons for there to be any real detail. So if we go into our plane and maybe increase the width segments to 100 and the height to 100, now we're getting some crazy looking mess over on the left hand side. So what we can do first of all to fix that is enable tessellation. That's basically going to work like a subdivision surface and smooth out all that detail we have going on. And the next thing we can do is decrease the height down to something like 3 centimeters. So now we're getting more of a subtle variation. It's still not quite the look we're going for, so what I'm going to do is go into the noise and increase the relative scale to 1000, and that's going to give us this streaky look to it. So this just helps to break it up a little bit. We could probably even dial it down a little bit more, maybe to like 2%. Just to give us some nice kind of details in the reflection and just add some variation to these edges as well. So I think there's a couple more things I did, and that was actually within the material. So I actually got another texture. It was the texture we originally looked at, so if I just find that quickly, this one here, and plug that into the surface quick. And what I did was actually rotate it 90 degrees and offsetted it just because I didn't like this area here, so something like this. And we use that for the bump map, so I'm going to press Shift C again and get a bump map and plug that texture into the bump map input, and then plug that into the overall bump input of the material and plug the material back into the surface. So now we get some nice details running through this surface here, and they're probably a bit too exaggerated at the moment, so maybe we could dial this down to like 0.3, something like that, maybe 0.5, just so we get some nice kind of bumps and details in the actual surface itself. And we could probably dial back the displacement still, maybe something like 1 centimeter, just so that we've got just a very subtle kind of variation in there. I could probably bring back the roughness on this just to make it a bit shinier. And we could use that same texture to drive the reflection roughness. The way we can do that is just get the same texture and just plug it into the reflection roughness. And it's not really making too much of a difference at the moment, so what I'm going to do is grab a ramp and plug that into the ramp, and then plug that into the reflection roughness. And let me just swap those around. And let's just bring in that white slider. And if I was to bring it all the way down to the end, you can see how it's starting to pick up on that texture, and that's driving what areas are reflective or not. But at the moment it's way too matte. So what we can do is just decrease this white down to something maybe like 50%, and that's going to bring that shine back into it. we're starting to pick up more on the details within the reflection. So you can kind of tweak this to however you like it. Maybe you want it a bit more matte, maybe you want it a bit more shiny, however really kind of, takes your fancy. Okay, and that's essentially how you create this effect. So if we were to scrub through this slowly, it's going to take a while to preview, but you can get the idea. We start with nothing here. As we scroll through, it starts to play that animation we exported from After Effects, and it's using that to drive the displacement, so you can start to see how the letters are coming in from left to right, with the R leading first and the S leading last. And as the white fades in more and more, the deboss is getting stronger. So as we scroll through, it's getting deeper here, until eventually we get to the final point where all letters have faded in, and we've got this final debossing effect here. And you could play with this and make the deboss even stronger. So I could come into displacement, turn this to like -6, and we're going to get a much deeper cut into the plane. So this is essentially just however you want to play with this and what kind of look you're going for. What I'm going to do just to end this on is actually jump into the original project file, just so you guys can see how I got this final result. It's essentially the same material, so all we've done is, so this ramp I've got here isn't actually doing anything, but I had it in there just in case I wanted to tweak the contrast. However, this one here is doing something. This is driving the reflection roughness. All I did was just bump up the white values so that when it's plugged in, we're just getting a bit more detail in the reflection. The texture is the exact same animation we've just set up, and the displacement's the same, -3. We've got the gamma override enabled, so that's all good. And all these settings are pretty much the same, probably just the colors are slightly different. Obviously the texture's driving the reflection roughness, and we've just got some kind of finer tweaking in these subsurface settings here. And then we're using a HDR to do the kind of key lighting on this. So just a simple studio HDR. That's basically lighting the whole scene, giving us some really nice shading and lighting. And then we're using this additional area light to just bringing this highlight here. If I was to zoom out, guys can just get an idea of the complete scene. It's really nothing too fancy. It's exactly the same as we've set up in this video, but I just thought you guys would probably want to see that since it's the one I showed at the beginning of the video. So, oh yeah, and then finally we've added this noise texture, which I've just added a bit of low clip and high clip to bring some more contrast in, but it's set really low, down to 2 centimeters. So hopefully you guys found this video helpful. Let me know if you did in the comment section down below. I really enjoyed making this one. This tutorial was actually a request from someone on Instagram. They saw this effect in the NARS video by Hello Playful, and they were like, do you know how to create this? And I was like, well, I'll find out. So I went away, figured out how to do it, and here we are. So if you guys ever have any requests for anything, let me know in the comment section down below. I'd really love to hear your ideas, and if there's something I think I can help out with, then I'll make a video on it. So thanks again for watching, guys. You know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe, notifications, and I will catch you in the next one. Alright, peace.